Okay, so imagine that you want to construct an offshore financial system from scratch, raise $32 billion in corporate capital, and command a platform handling $10 billion in daily trading volume, all without an internal accounting department, without a functioning board of directors, and while using off-the-books messaging apps that automatically erase your executive communications every 24 hours. You want to run a global clearinghouse for digital assets where customer deposits are quietly rerouted into a private investment vehicle to cover its bad leverage, underwrite real estate acquisitions, and fund millions of dollars in political donations. Sounds like an impossible, highly volatile strategy. And yet, for 36 months, that was precisely the core operating model of FTX and its sister hedge fund, Alameda Research. This was not a complex technological black box. It was a classic structural failure masked as high-frequency innovation. To understand how an $8 billion liquidity hole opened up in less than 2 weeks, you have to look past the media coverage of cryptocurrency trading and analyze the fundamental corporate mechanics. What failed in November 2022 was not the underlying blockchain technology, but rather the internal controls of an empire built on what insolvency experts later termed the complete absence of corporate governance. It was an executive architecture designed without firewalls, where customer assets and speculative risk shared a single balance sheet. The structural preconditions for this enterprise were forged between 2017 and 2019, amidst a massive regulatory vacuum in global financial technology. The rapidly growing digital asset ecosystem required specialized liquidity providers, firms willing to make markets absorb order flow and bridge price gaps between different exchanges across Asia, Europe, and North America. Alameda Research was created to exploit these exact structural inefficiencies, initially arbitraging the persistent price differences for digital assets between Western and Asian markets. However, as the capital demands of high-frequency trading grew, Alameda encountered a persistent obstacle. Traditional financial institutions were reluctant to extend multi-billion-dollar credit lines or wire clearing services to unregulated entities operating in volatile markets. The solution was the creation of FTX in 2019. Headquartered initially in Hong Kong and later relocated to Nassau, the Bahamas. FTX provided the crucial missing piece of the puzzle: direct control over a global customer exchange. The offshore jurisdiction of the Bahamas provided a specific regulatory environment that allowed FTX to offer ultra-high leverage to international traders, leverage ratios as high as 20-to-1, which were entirely unavailable under tighter regulatory regimes in the United States or Western Europe. This regulatory arbitrage allowed FTX to capture market share at a speed rarely seen in conventional finance. Within 2 years, the platform had onboarded over 1 million users, ranging from retail day traders to major institutional hedge funds. The structural flaw, however, was baked into the architecture from the very beginning. In a traditional financial market, an exchange is an independent venue where buyers and sellers meet. The exchange does not trade against its users, and it strictly segregates customer collateral from its own operational accounts. Clear divisions are enforced by custodian banks, clearinghouses, and independent auditors. FTX bypasses this basic structural separation entirely. It operated simultaneously as the exchange, the custodian, and through Alameda Research, the primary market maker. This created a profound structural conflict of interest. The platform hosting the market was directly connected to a private trading desk that held an unrestricted backdoor into the exchange's liquidity pools. To understand how money entered, multiplied, and ultimately disappeared through this system, you have to examine the hidden mechanism that drove the FTX Alameda balance sheet, what can be called the illiquid token leverage loop. When retail and institutional clients deposited legal tender or liquid cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin and Ethereum onto the FTX platform, those assets were supposed to sit in omnibus client accounts, available for withdrawal at any time. Instead, an internal software mechanism permitted Alameda Research to maintain a functionally infinite negative balance on the FTX engine. Rather than being blocked by automatic liquidation algorithms when its trades lost money, Alameda was granted an explicit line of code that allowed its accounts to trade with negative balances up to tens of billions of dollars. The financial capital deposited by standard users was systematically diverted to fund Alameda's private corporate ventures, venture capital investments, and real estate purchases. But to maintain the illusion of solvency to outside investors and auditors, the enterprise relied on self-generated digital assets, most notably a custom token known as FTT. Created by FTX, FTT was a utility token that offered holders lower trading fees on the exchange. FTX controlled the total circulating supply of FTT, releasing only a tiny fraction into the public market. Because the public float was small and trading volumes were low, FTX and Alameda could artificially inflate the token's market price through strategic market-making operations. Once FTT attained a high market capitalization on paper, Alameda placed vast tranches of these low-liquidity, self-issued tokens onto its balance sheet as primary collateral. Alameda then took these hyperinflated, self-created tokens and used them as collateral to borrow real, liquid capital, actual dollars, and establish cryptocurrencies from institutional crypto lenders such as BlockFi, Genesis, and Celsius. The financial mechanism was entirely circular. FTX printed a token out of thin air. Alameda supported its paper valuation through high-volume internal trading, and then used that paper asset to secure billions in actual debt. According to later filings by the United States Securities and Exchange Commission, this process turned Alameda into a black hole for customer funds. By mid-2022, when global interest rates rose and digital asset valuations across the broader financial ecosystem began to plummet, institutional lenders began calling in their loans to Alameda to service these massive debt obligations and avoid a public default. Alameda continuously drew down on the ultimate source of liquid capital left to it, the cash and liquid crypto assets deposited by retail and institutional customers on the FTX exchange. The sheer scale of this dynamic was staggering, placing FTX among the largest operational corporate failures in financial history. At its absolute peak in early 2022, FTX was valued by top-tier venture capital firms at $32 billion. It had raised over $2 billion in private equity from some of the most prominent institutional investment funds in Silicon Valley and Wall Street, including Sequoia Capital, Temasek, and the Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan. Yet beneath this multi-billion-dollar valuation lay a balance sheet built almost entirely on illiquid, unbacked paper assets. John J. Ray Roman III, the veteran restructuring specialist appointed as chief executive officer of FTX during its bankruptcy proceedings, who had previously overseen the liquidation of Enron, stated under oath before the United States House Committee on Financial Services that he had never in his career seen such a complete failure of corporate controls and such a total absence of trustworthy financial information. At the time of its collapse in November 2022, FTX held approximately $9 billion in customer liabilities against less than $1 billion in easily realizable liquid assets. The shortfall was roughly $8 billion. To put that figure in context, an $8 billion cash deficit instantly erased the life savings of hundreds of thousands of retail depositors across dozens of countries, while leaving elite corporate investors holding equity stakes that were marked down to zero overnight. The headcount of this multi-billion-dollar international empire was shockingly small. While a traditional global financial exchange or bank with a similar transaction volume employs tens of thousands of compliance officers, risk managers, and internal auditors, FTX was operated by a core group of fewer than 20 individuals concentrated in a single corporate compound in the Bahamas. There was no independent risk committee, no chief risk officer, and no consolidated corporate ledger. The entire financial management of a business holding billions in liabilities was recorded using consumer-grade accounting software and managed through casual messaging platforms like Slack and Signal. The breaking point arrived in November 2022, triggered not by a government raid or a regulatory enforcement action, but by a classic crisis of confidence accelerating a bank run on an illiquid reserve. On November 2, 2022, a financial news outlet, CoinDesk, published a leaked copy of Alameda Research's internal balance sheet. The document revealed the fundamental systemic fragility of the entire enterprise. Out of $14.6 billion in total assets claimed by Alameda, a massive portion consisted of FTT, the exact token printed by FTX, and other related low-liquidity tokens issued directly by the platform's founders. The firm's equity base was not backed by hard cash, treasury bills, or liquid sovereign debt, but by its own corporate self-dealing. The market reaction was swift and devastating. Institutional market participants recognized immediately that if Alameda were forced to liquidate its massive holding of FTT to service its real-world debts, the token's price would collapse to zero, completely wiping out Alameda's solvency. On November 6, Changpeng Zhao, the chief executive of Binance, FTX's primary global rival, announced publicly via social media that his company would liquidate its entire holding of FTT tokens due to recent risk disclosures. That single announcement initiated an immediate, unstoppable bank run. Within 72 hours, FTX customers rushed to withdraw an estimated $6 billion from the platform. Under normal banking regulations or traditional exchange rules, customer assets are held one-to-one in segregated trust accounts, allowing an exchange to meet any volume of redemptions seamlessly. But FTX did not have the money. The liquid customer deposits had long since been transferred to Alameda to pay off its external creditors and cover bad speculative trades. As the withdrawal queue surged, the structural hole in FTX's balance sheet was laid bare. On November 8, FTX officially halted customer withdrawals. The platform attempted to negotiate an emergency rescue package with external investors and rival exchanges, but a brief due diligence review by potential buyers revealed the irreversible nature of the $8 billion deficit. On November 11, 2022, FTX, Alameda Research, and over 100 affiliated corporate entities officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in the District of Delaware. The legal and regulatory fallout was swift. Within weeks, federal prosecutors for the Southern District of New York unsealed criminal indictments charging the executive leadership of FTX with wire fraud, securities fraud, commodities fraud, and money laundering. The legal filings documented how the firm's executive team had deliberately obscured Alameda's access to customer funds, falsified financial reporting to lenders, and used diverted corporate funds to expend tens of millions of dollars on illegal political contributions designed to influence regulatory policy in Washington. The legacy of the FTX collapse extends far beyond the bankruptcy court in Delaware. The structural wreckage forced a fundamental, permanent shift in how global financial regulators treat digital asset platforms, custodial accounting, and cross-border financial entities. Governments around the world immediately abandoned their light-touch regulatory approach, replacing it with mandatory proof of reserve requirements, direct enforcement actions, and strict statutory bans on the mixing of exchange platforms with proprietary trading desks. Major financial institutions that had previously flirted with offshore digital venues retreated to heavily regulated, traditional custodial banks. Yet despite the catastrophic failure of the institution, the core economic reality remains unchanged. The fall of FTX was not a failure of complex financial code, but a reminder of an age-old banking rule. You cannot back real, liquid liabilities with self-issued illiquid paper. The fancy corporate logos and offshore offices disappeared into liquidation proceedings. The fundamental rules of balance sheet mechanics did not.